I would like to welcome you very much, Dr. Peter Verhagen, to the Oral History of Tibetan Studies project conducted at Oxford. Mm-hmm. We are very happy that we can include you among our interviewees. I would like to start by asking you about your origin. Where do you come from?
Good. Well, okay. The first question, the first answer to the first question would be I come from the place we're in now, from Amsterdam. I was born in 1957, 26th of September, in this town, and even in the same part of town. We're in the northern part of Amsterdam, and I've lived in Amsterdam all my life. I come from a family that's very humble in its social aspect. My father was a laborer, worked in the docks. My mother was a seamstress. My father was actually quite a simple man. He actually never finished elementary school even. My mother had a bit more schooling, but she was very soon devoted to working as a seamstress. She was really the matrona of the family, and indeed has played a big part in my life in many respects. I'll tell a bit more about that in a minute. Unfortunately, both of them are no longer among us. My father passed away quite young. My mother passed away some 10 years ago, and the last years of her life I was her caretaker during her period of dementia. I have one sister only. We're in her flat at this moment, Tony Verhagen, who is a very wonderful person, very empathetic, I'm not sure about the English here, person who can get along with almost anyone. She has a very, very generous, warm heart, and she's about 10 years older than I am, so I'm the Benjamin. I grew up in this area, and that was at the time a typically working class neighborhood. Although it was a kind of a village at the time, although it was very near to the center of town, so we had all the benefits of being near to the heart of Amsterdam, but still the quiet of the countryside. It may not surprise you that I had a very early fascination for languages. In fact, quite recently my sister reminded me, of course I didn't remember, but I'd heard the story before, that when I was 4 years old and we were sharing the bedroom, in fact the bedroom of her parents, and she was exercising her German and French and English vocabulary. She did that aloud, and I repeated it and memorized it along with her. I've attempted writing letters in English when I was 7, mainly in that case to apply for a pass to the paddock for the Dutch Grand Prix. I was a great fan of motor racing at the time. So I had this thing with languages. My parents didn't have religion as such. They were atheistic, agnostic, I guess you could call it. But there was in the family a strong sense of higher powers that were at work, but not in any kind of organized religion form. There was also at the time in Amsterdam in general, but also in my family, a place for kind of faith healing, magnetizing, they used to call it. I'm not sure if that's correct English. So it was very common if the doctor didn't find the source of the problem, you would go to a magnetizer. And one of my aunts actually had this gift also. I love to draw. I love to draw from as long as I can remember, starting with cowboys and Indians, of course, but later on mainly racing cars. I love them. I love music, still do, starting from the Beatles and Rolling Stones in that era. I was crazy about that. At a certain point I heard and saw a TV documentary about a piano player, Vladimir Ashkenazy, a very famous one. And I saw this one shot where he was playing a bagatelle of Beethoven, and it was so intense. The drops of sweat were falling on the keys, and I was fascinated from that time on by the music of Beethoven. So I listened to Beethoven only for a year or two. But music was always there. Elementary school was a very important period for me because it was the time when I met my later mentor. I will tell in a minute a bit about that. But so I went to school in Amsterdam North, in the same area. I was actually quite a mediocre pupil. I didn't have. Well, I'm not sure what it was, but I never got high grades. I got 6s, maybe 1 or 2 7s, and that was it. But I was fascinated by languages, and I took some extra classes in French already in 5th grade. But the main thing in that period of my life was my meeting with Ronald Poelmeijer. And I can tell you the exact day when that happened, namely my 10th birthday. I was at school, and as is the custom in Holland, when a kid has his birthday, he shares sweets with all the classmates. And I was doing exactly that when he was introduced to the class, when he actually entered the classroom for the first time. He was about to be our teacher for that term, and so actually the very first thing I did when I met him was offering him a sweet, which is exactly what you need to do when you meet your guru. You need to offer a sweet, and fate had it that I did. He was there in that year, so in 5th grade, my teacher at the elementary school. He talked about a lot of things that other teachers didn't. He introduced me to some idea of the outside world, outside of Europe, especially Asia, had his attention already. Also his teaching methods were very innovative. Now looking back, I can see that he was using Chomskyan techniques to teach Dutch language to the 5th graders. So it was a very, very fascinating teacher, and he certainly grabbed my attention, and we remained in touch. He taught only for 1 year, but after that we remained in touch. He played also an important role in the choice of my high school. My mother was in fact invited by him to have a talk when the choice of the next school was at hand, and he had somehow, I don't know how, but met or seen something in me, kind of kindred spirit, I guess. So he advised my mother to choose the highest level of education possible. And she did, and that was a school in the center of town, actually, not in North, but in a wonderful spot, right across the Wester Tower, so the heart of town, canals there. And I started there in 1975. Ronald Poelmeijer, my later mentor, in the meantime quit his job as a school teacher and went on to study Tibetan and Sanskrit and Southeast and South and Central Asian art, and graduated very quickly, and in fact got a job only after a few years as a lecturer in Leiden University. But in the meantime, we remaining in touch, he taught me Tibetan, so I started, well, at primary school at first started learning writing Gothic alphabet, and Egyptian hieroglyphs, scripts fascinated me. But around the 1st grade of high school, he started teaching me Tibetan. So I started learning Tibetan when I was 11, or actually 12. But that continued all through my high school period. So in fact, in 2nd grade of the high school, I already knew exactly what I was going to do. I was going to study Tibetan and Sanskrit, and that was it. And I never changed my mind, I never looked back. and it actually happened that way. The teaching of Poelmeijer, Ronald, he was a close friend later on, was very intensive, but also very varied. He would inform me about all things Tibetan, ranging from language to culture, to art, to history, religion, of course. And his requirements were quite severe. Occasionally I would come to his house in the morning, and he would open the door and only speak Tibetan for the rest of the day to me. Everywhere we went, in the bus, in the shops, only Tibetan. So I was really put under a strict regime then, but it worked. The music in that period also started to turn towards Asia. I saw Ravi Shankar in 1968 and was totally blown away, as I say, flabbergasted. I remember still traveling home in a kind of different world. I also had my first experiences with Tibetan lamas then, the Karmapa, then still the 16th, visited Amsterdam and performed the Black Hat ceremony, I think in 73 or 74. And I was there, which was a very strange evening in a way. There was a very strong sense of power in the air, but also a kind of eerie feeling, kind of foreboding feeling. It was a very, very strange evening, that particular one, but very impressive. So that more or less is what took place during my high school years. Then as I had already decided very early on, actually did continue to study Tibetan and Sanskrit from 1975 onwards. At the time, it was still possible to do Sanskrit and Indian studies in more than one university in Holland, in fact 4. There was Groningen, Utrecht, Leiden and Amsterdam, all 4 had departments of Indian studies. Now, in recent years it has been reduced to 1, there's only Leiden left. Tibetan was always only taught in Leiden, so I was studying in fact at 2 universities. I did my major in Sanskrit in Amsterdam and did Tibetan in Leiden. During that time I had several jobs in bookstores, especially, no wonder, perhaps, and also some spells, some brief appointments as a student assistant, working mainly in the library of the Buddhist Studies department in Leiden. So that's the early 1980s. The good thing of studying at the time was there was no time pressure. You could take your time, and especially in my case when I had jobs next to it, I did. I studied for more than 8 years. But in these years I've taken classes in every conceivable topic in or near my field. So all kinds of classes on art and history and languages. Which was fantastic, of course, and I feel sorry sometimes for the modern students that don't have that opportunity. It's really a wonderful thing to have. The Tibetan teaching that Poelmeijer was giving me continued, therefore. It started out, his teaching me started out at primary school level. During my high school years, he taught me Tibetan privately. And when I finished high school, I went on to study, and he was teaching me Tibetan at Leiden University. So that's a lifelong guruship. He was always very interested in a few specific topics, one of them being indigenous grammar. He was really an expert on that, which shows up in my later own research interests. But not only that, he was in fact working for many years on Lamrim Chamol and philosophy of the Gelugpa. school. He was interested also in Tibetan medicine. He taught me some Mongolian and Tibeto-Mongol relationships, and culture was one of his loves. And art, material culture and art was also. So I was really imbued with kind of everything and anything Tibetan. Fellow students, there are a few that I'm still in touch with. There's one, Jos Takema, who studied in Amsterdam, and we've remained in touch. He has had jobs at the Ethnology Museum in Leiden and also nowadays in Leeuwarden. Herco van Bergen, another good friend from that era, went on to do ICT, but still is doing privately Tibetan work. Ellen Raven is one of my colleagues in Leiden. She teaches Southeast Asian art. No, South Asian only. So there's a few contacts that have remained since then. During my studies I wrote, because I had, at least it felt to me, I had two main topics, Sanskrit and Tibetan, so I wrote two MA theses, one for Amsterdam, one for Leiden. And both are a kind of foreshadowing of what I went on to do later, especially the Amsterdam one about the first chapter of the translation into Tibetan of Panini, one of the Indian grammars. For Leiden I wrote a thesis on hymn to Manjushri. But that was and has remained my focus, the focus on indigenous grammar, both the grammar of Sanskrit in Tibet and in Tibetan, but also the Tibetan indigenous grammars. Both I've worked on intensively, and that started out already then. These research interests actually followed pretty much naturally, if not automatically, from my teachers. I had in Amsterdam Roodbergen, a famous expert on Panini, who taught me, and on the Leiden side I had Ronald Boelmeijer, who was the one of the leading experts really on Tibetan Sunta, on grammar. So it was natural for me to stay within that area and combine the two actually. In my PhD research, which I started in '87, which was on the primarily, initially, canonical literature and the translations into Tibetan of works on Sanskrit grammar. There were 47 of them. When I was appointed as a PhD researcher, I also started teaching. So from '87 onwards, I've taught Tibetan in Leiden till the present day. Of course, in many different guises and at many different institutes. Many changes have taken place. I started out teaching Tibetan, primarily classical Tibetan, at what was called the Instituut Kern, and later on, after a couple of mergers and reorganizations, I'm now appointed in an institute called the Leiden Institute for Area Studies, LIAS. But uninterrupted since '87, I've been teaching that. Then follows my PhD thesis that was finished in 1991 on this history of Sanskrit grammatical studies in Tibet, focusing, as I said, on the canonical literature in the first instance. My committee, the supervisors at the time, were in fact three, you could say. Vetter, who was the main promoter, as it's called in Dutch, from Leiden, Bronkhorst, also a Dutchman, scholar on Panini and philosophy from Lausanne, and Roy Andrew Miller from Seattle at the time. Unfortunately, in these years, the health of Ronald Boelmeijer started to become very problematic. He had a very poor health to start with, but finally succumbed to a number of diseases that cut his life much too short. So pretty soon I was left to my own device and felt like, it feels like I succeeded him in a way, but unfortunately he didn't share much of that time with me. My connection with Roy Miller, maybe a few things, but no, maybe that can wait a bit. It started out then, but later on we stayed in touch and we became good friends. And he has become a very important figure in that research area. And but that's for later. Maybe one thing I want to tell about this period, and that maybe is also a good thing for a young scholar to be aware of, the danger of plagiarism. I suffered a very severe case of that. My PhD thesis was finished in '91, as I said. As is usual in Holland, you print extra copies and distribute them among colleagues and friends, and I did. And one of these colleagues handed one of these printed theses to an Indian scholar who was working in the same field, Narendra Kumar Das. He was gladly surprised, obviously, because within a year he published a book which for more than 95% consisted verbatim of my words. So he just copied 2 chapters from my thesis and published it under his own name. When I found out, I got in touch with him and also my publisher, because although it hadn't appeared yet, I had a contract already with Brill for them to publish the book. Brill contacted the publisher in India, but nothing could really be done. The pertinent convention, I think the Geneva Convention, is not signed by India, so copyrights on books are hard to defend in that country. The publisher guaranteed that the book would be taken out of circulation. I don't think it was, because a few years later I found a copy in an Amsterdam bookstore. Anyway, that was the publisher's side. The man himself was a story in itself. In his first reaction, he pleaded ignorance. Oh, I didn't know that I wasn't supposed to do that. No, if he first denied he did it, but well, it was very obvious, it was verbatim. He'd made really silly mistakes, like copying forthcoming titles from my bibliography. Later on, he admitted that he had done it, but he begged me to forgive him. In fact, it turned into a kind of blackmail situation, because he threatened to commit suicide if I didn't forgive him. And I thought that was a bit much, so in the end I forgave him, but I caught him plagiarizing again years later, so it didn't help really. The man actually built an academic career in India on the basis of that book. And years later, Santiniketan, years later, I was contacted by a few colleagues of his, and he was planning to put out a second edition of the same book, and that I thought was too much. Anyway, his colleagues thought the same, because all of India by that time knew about the affair. So he actually did commit suicide in the end, because of the shame when it came to light. It was a man obviously with very severe psychological problems. But it was a very nasty experience. It made me very suspicious of sharing materials for a number of years. I've gotten over it, but still. It's especially because my book hadn't come out yet. His book beat me to it, you know. Maybe a few words about the OHTS and the world of Tibetology. If you want to put in questions or if there's anything.
I have a few questions still going to the material or period you've just covered, if I may.
Yes, please.
Could you say something more about your mentor, Ronald Perlmeyer?
Yes.
Where did he learn Tibetan? What was his background? How did he come to be an elementary teacher than a high school mentor,
Right.
probably a private mentor for high school students, and
Yeah.
then he became a university teacher.
Yes. That is indeed a good question. As far as I can tell, there were two forces at work there. In his youth, he had, just like me, at a very early age, broad fascination for foreign exotic cultures and history of faraway countries. I have heard him tell about his very young youth when he built a kind of Aztec pyramid in which he kept his collection of ants, that kind of thing. So he had an early fascination, and I think one of his link with Tibet originated in his interest in Buddhism. He was one of the very first Dutch to be involved in that. There were very few. There was actually only one biggish Buddhist organization that was starting around that time, focusing on Zen Buddhism. But how in the end he ended up with this specific focus on Tibet, I couldn't know. I couldn't tell you. He's never really told me. It seemed so obvious to me. I never really asked him, really. It was never a topic. I mean, we were both into that same fascination. And maybe I was a bit too young to wonder about the backgrounds and the history of that kind of thing. So that was his own personal thing. Why didn't he start doing that straight away? That was his parents. His father was very strict and insisted that he should have a proper education and have a real job. And his idea of a real job would be, for instance, teaching at primary schools. So that's what he did. He followed his father's the words and did that for 1 year only, but it wasn't his world, it wasn't for him. And after this 1 year in which he taught the class I was in, he quit the job and followed his heart and started doing the thing he really wanted. So that's how he first, for this one brief year, did this job that didn't fit in with the rest. I'm glad he did, because I wouldn't have met him if he hadn't. It's such an important element in my life. It would have been. I can't really imagine what my life would have looked like without having met him.
How did he learn Tibetan and Sanskrit or other languages?
He started Sanskrit only at the university level. He did start doing some Tibetan before that time. There was a native speaker in Leiden. There was a geshe, in fact a Mongolian geshe, Ngawan Yima, a great scholar. I think, if I remember well, he was one of the tutors of one of the brothers of the Dalai Lama, so High Gelugpa Lama. So that's one thing, the native speaker that was available, which since then has not been the case. The man left Leiden University just before I started as a student, and since then there's been no native speakers. So. But he was there for a few years then, and that I think played a role.
Why did you find these cultures interesting?
Yeah, I've wondered often about that too. How to put that into words, if I can at all. I can maybe best start by telling how it started out for me. What I was fascinated about in the first instance was the writing. I was always into scripts, and the more exotic the better. And it more or less linked up with my love of drawing. I drew as a child, and I loved doing that, and it was a kind of drawing exercise also. But after a while, of course, you get curious what these scribblings mean. But why specifically Tibet? Well, it was handed to me in a way because Ronald had already taken that path. I've often wondered if he would have been interested in Portuguese or Aztec or whatever. I might have ended up there, who knows? I don't think, but it felt like the natural thing to me, to do to me. I never really wondered about why, and maybe I should do now that at the age I'm in now, but I really couldn't tell you, really. I mean, it's all of it. It's the whole thing. It's the country. It's the people. It's the way of thinking of Buddhist philosophy. The whole picture. I guess it was just a matter of fascination. I mean, if I were a real Buddhist, I might perhaps say it was karma or was a Tibetan in a previous life. I don't know. Maybe I was. I don't really know. But that's the only real explanation that I could think of. And other than coincidence, just happening to meet with this one person and of course, learning a language at such a young age is very easy. When you're 11 or 12, you pick up languages like it's nothing. And that added to the love, of course, also. I mean, Tibetan really sank into the deep layers of my psyche. And so I'm imbued with it in that way, in that sense. Is that an answer? It's an attempt at it, anyway.
How did you study with him, or how did you learn with him? You learned probably two languages. You mentioned Sanskrit, classical Tibetan, and colloquial.
No, not really. He had some Sanskrit knowledge, but I started learning Sanskrit only when I started at university. So in high school, in that period, I was only doing classical Tibetan with him. Of course, Sanskrit comes into play. There's so many titles, book titles, and names of scholars and that. So. But not really the language acquisition, let's say. No, how did I study? I went to his house 2-3 times a week and just spent all day there. And we would do all kinds of things that would involve much teaching, but also in a very loose manner. I mean, we would be discussing Tibetan subjects while we were doing shopping. It was non-stop. First, before I actually decided to really be serious about it, when I was visiting him when I was still in elementary school, so when I was 11, I took notes. I mean, visiting him was like going to a class. I was taking notes. I had to write down all this information that was coming in before I forgot. So I was very eager to drink that all up. And as I said before, sometimes he would only speak Tibetan for days on end. Sometimes I must admit that he was not as successful as he could have been. Spoken Tibetan has never become my forte. I've always really been focusing on classical Tibetan. But he tried. It's not for lack of his trying, it's my lack of talent, I guess. And also the lack of native speakers. I mean, there's no Tibetans that at least were attached to the university. Yeah, and then it was in all levels. I mean, he would make Tibetan tea, we would eat momos, well, as long as it was vegetarian. It was in every respect and every aspect of daily life. So it was not long before we, of course, inevitably became great friends. I mean, sharing so much time, your best teachers become your friends anyway, I think.
Could you say a bit more about your university studies? How did you learn? How did the classes look like?
Okay, well, most of the classes I took were not on a very large scale in the sense of student numbers. I was the numbers of language class students would usually be limited to 5, maybe 10 at most. For the art history and history classes, there might be a few more, might be 15 to 20, but usually classes were small. That goes for both Amsterdam and Leiden University. In Amsterdam, there were 2 institutes for Indian studies. One, the languages. That was, it's incredible if I hear myself say it now, all these years later, none of it is left. There were 2 professors and 2 full-time lecturers, one for modern Indian languages, basically Hindi, some Tamil, and one for Sanskrit, and also 2 lecturers for these same areas. There was a separate institute for art history and history, which was headed by then very famous scholar Van Lohuizen, expert on the field of Scythian art, Shaka period, early history of Indian art. So I took classes with her. I also, with my interest in languages, took general linguistics, ranging from psycholinguistics to generative phonology and all that kind of thing. In fact, the only one failing grade I ever got was at the Department of Linguistics in the field of semantics. That was too mathematic for me. I couldn't handle that. But and these were the main areas that I seriously took classes in. So South Asia in India, in Amsterdam, and also linguistics mainly in Amsterdam, and Central Asia, Tibet, Mongolia in Leiden. For Tibetan, usually the numbers of students were smaller. I think the very first year I had 3 colleagues, were 4 in all, and that is actually the average that it has remained up till this day. There's occasionally a year where there's maybe 5, 6. 2 years ago there were 10, and I was really surprised by that, but averaging, I would say 5 is the number of students that take Tibetan classes. For Tibetan history, I've developed courses on classical and modern history of Tibet also. There the numbers are much greater. But these courses didn't exist when I was a student, so I developed them later on. So it was always, in Dutch lesson I was saying, very apt in this situation, keukentafelonderwijs, kitchen table education. So seated around the table with your students and talking, not teaching ex cathedra or something like that, you know. And that's the good thing, of course, of studying, but it is also, and especially later on, in the modern era, has become a threat or a problem in a way by the financial, the managers of the universities that insist on having as many students as possible. And well, that's the kind of thing that Tibetan simply doesn't draw. We don't draw that high number of students, at least not a number high enough for the managers to be happy. In Leiden nowadays there's a basic principle that is followed in most faculties, that if you have 17 students, then you're viable, then it's economically viable. Less, then you have to supply good reasons why you exist. And that's one thing that that's always been the weakness of these studies. There's never been big numbers. Also in in art history and these kind of fields, it's hard to reach up to these standards that are demanded. But in my time, it was really a cozy, small group of friends that shared the experience of a class.
Did you learn the languages by reading texts?
Yes, well, there was spoken tuition also by Ronald, but 9 out of 10, 99% perhaps of the time, yes, written documents, and that has remained the material that I've worked on ever since. Yeah.
What kind of texts did you read in the classes?
During the university period, we would be reading things like Atisha, Bodhipata Pradipa, Kampupa, Jewel Ornament. We've read Lamrim Chimel, historiographical texts. We read royal annals from the royal period. Poetry, things like the Six Dalai Lama's poems and that kind of thing. Biographies, could be from a wide range of topics. Depended also, and I followed that, Ronald did that and I did after him. At the beginning of the year I speak to my students and ask them what they're interested in. And if I can accommodate, I will read that with them. So that means that I've got to read medical texts and all kinds of things, which is very educational also for the lecturer. I mean, there's no better way of learning than by teaching. By teaching it, you get into areas where you wouldn't naturally or automatically come just in your own research. So it's a wide range, yeah.
You also mentioned that you were interested in art.
Mm-hmm.
Could you say something about it?
Yes, well, at the time there was no professorship of Tibetan art. There was only Ronald. He did all of Tibet language and culture. So my introduction to art was also mainly at his hand. Before I started as a student, and even also when I was one, we would go to museums, special exhibitions or not. We would go to galleries, auctions. Of course, he also collected Tibetan art, so there was lots of that material culture around to study and to admire. So yeah, any opportunity we would get to view some Tibetan art, we would grab with both hands. And at the time, I mean, I was still a very poor student, but he had the luxury of being able to buy some really wonderful Tibetan art. It was the time before when the prices went sky high. So you could buy a real good bronze for a moderate price, and that was still possible then, and he did. So all these things, it was, and of course having that at hand in his house was wonderful. You know, you can handle it. It's not. That was also why we loved viewing days of auction houses. You know, you could touch the things, not in behind glass or protected by some other device. You could handle it, and that also adds to your love for it. I think you get real close to it and feel the tactile part of admiring art. I've always found it very special. So that way.
What did you like about Tibetan art?
Well, I liked the, I guess you could say, the surprising nature of it. What kind of art has both the tranquil, peaceful figure of the Buddha and these demonic, terrifying deities, and they're both equally sacred. the colors, also in the painting. I mean, the brightness, the use of colors, the refinement of it. A good tanka done by a good artist, I can admire for hours at end. The detailing. One thing that I found, the only thing maybe that I found missing, big word that found missing in Tibetan art, was the freedom that modern Western art has, the liberty of choosing any topic. Modern Tibetan artists, they do have that, and there's some very good ones. I know just a few months ago saw some excellent exhibition in Chengdu of modern Tibetan art. But classical art is kind of restricted to the iconography and the conventions, and that sometimes annoyed me a bit, but very rarely. I mean, within these confinements of the iconography, there was so much artistic ability and talent to admire. But it was okay. Yeah. So, if that is a question, if that is an answer, that's what I could say about it.
What did you like about Tibetan grammar? That was your main topic.
Right. Not only Tibetan grammar, but also Sanskrit grammar have a few things in common that I admire, and maybe the one most important thing is economy. Economy of words, not of financial economy. No, economy of words. The rules that Tibetan and Indian grammarians set up are very short and contain enormous amount of information. So it's very condensed. And that puzzle kind of drew me to find out these 2 or 3 or maybe 10 syllables, how they could possibly indicate something as complicated as a grammatical operation. And the way they do that is so clever. That is what fascinated me, really. And I also very much like, not only for these 2 languages, but not only like, I prefer also to hear how a speaker of a language describes and writes about his own language. I know there's great merit in us Westerners doing that kind of thing, and it's important. Linguists all over the world, they should tackle any language they choose, but there is an added value to the grammar that is written by a Tibetan grammar that is written by a Tibetan. The knowledge of the language is simply deeper, I think. I hope I'm not offending any linguist now, but that's the sense I get.
Peter, you mentioned also that you did 2 master theses. Mm-hmm. How did that happen?
Well, it was really a matter of my own choice. Formally speaking, Sanskrit Indian studies was my major, and Tibetan was a minor, but I'd done really as much in Tibetan as I had done in Sanskrit. So I thought it appropriate, and maybe also thinking about future possibilities, about applying for jobs and subsidies and that kind of thing, to have written a thesis also in Tibetan. But there was no requirement. I simply chose to do it. And that was okay. Ronald was fine by it. He didn't object at all, of course. But that's the reason. So, and of course I had the time. I could take my time doing this study, and I had the time to write too. So that's it.
Could you say a bit more about your PhD, please?
Yes. I was about to start into that. Maybe skip the ITS. We'll come a bit later to that. First, the PhD, right? As I said, it was written between 87 and 91. And it dealt with the translated works on Sanskrit grammar in Tenjur, so the Tibetan canon. There were 47 of them, and I've worked through that material. Also looked at some earlier material from Tajor Pampunyipa, the famous commentary on Mahavyupati from the royal period. And I also looked at some historiography, what Buddha and Taranatha and other historians wrote about the study of Sanskrit in India and in Tibet. And all that ended up in my thesis. This description of the canonical literature took the bulk of the time. I mean, some 2,000 pages that I worked through, so that already took quite a long time. And of course, exploring new ground, there was hardly anything done on that topic at all, and certainly no survey of it. So I had to indeed find my own way into unknown territory, which is wonderful, but also quite time-consuming. I managed somehow. Of course, helped by the great tuition I had from Verhagen and from Roland. But in the end, on my own steam, I managed to finish this thesis. It was very wonderful to see how it was received at the time. I will mention a bit about that when I speak about the OHTSs. And after the defense, so in 91, it took about 2 years almost to be before it was published in Leiden at Brils as the first volume of A History of Sanskrit Grammatical Literature in Tibet, which, as I told you before, came out after the plagiarized version, but it did come out. When I finished my PhD, straight away I was awarded a fellowship by the Royal Academy, the Royal Dutch Academy, actually Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, which gave me the opportunity to write volume 2, to continue research on this field, now expanding it to the original Tibetan works, so not only the canonical like in volume 1, but what did the Tibetans themselves write about these topics. That turned out to be also quite a lot. Of course, nowadays we have much more available than at the time, but even then it was more than 50 titles of some quite extensive works in some cases. And these 2 volumes that they have both appeared at Brill, they attempt a kind of a general survey, an overview of what happened in Tibet in this area of Sanskrit grammar, what was translated from Sanskrit and what was written by the Tibetans in Tibetan. Well, this brings me to a next volume, a next book, but that's for later. My interest in the research in this field not only found its way into these 2 books, but also into a number of series of articles. One series dealing with the same topic, that is Sanskrit grammar in Tibet, but also one on Tibetan indigenous grammar, which were published during the same period. The KNW fellowship was not just for research, but also for my working conditions, really the best I could get. It gave me the opportunity to buy books for the library, to travel wherever I wanted, so I could attend every conceivable conference and visit institutes, and I did. This gave me an opportunity to meet with colleagues all over the world and build up friendships also outside of these big conferences, which are important, but to have this liberty was splendid and gave me great chances to spread the word, which was in a way what I was doing. I mean, it was clear for some scholars from the outset that it was valuable, but it wasn't a field that many people were working on, so you really had to explain from the bottom up the whole thing, and that's very nice thing to do, especially if you spend such a long time in that field. You get this sense of connection to it, and it felt like well, missionary is a big word, but it's a kind of work of a labor of love. Let's put it that way. That sounds a bit better, I think. I felt this topic was really important. I think it was important. I thought and still think it is important because so much in Tibetan literature is translated. All the basic works that Buddhism has brought into Tibet were translated from Sanskrit. So how did they do that? How is it possible even that Tibetans, so few in numbers really, through the centuries there have been maybe a few hundred Sanskrit scholars in Tibet, how did they manage to produce this huge literature? I mean, you know, Kanjur Tenjur, it fills a library almost. How did they manage to do that? And one thing that made them able to do that was their knowledge of the language, the knowledge of Sanskrit. So it was really also in a way surprising to me that no one really had touched that field before. But that was fine by me because I was fascinated by it, and I felt it was important, and I found since publishing these things that many colleagues agree, and they're glad that I did the work. But still, there's very few that actually enter into the field themselves. I've had a number of colleagues really working on indigenous grammar, and especially Sanskrit grammar in Tibet can be counted on the fingers of a few hands. There's very few. And that's still surprising to me. If you take into consideration how important their knowledge of that grammar is and was for their translating activities. And I think it's one of the vital elements that led to the success of the spread of Buddhism. The fact that they were able to translate these sometimes very complicated works. And I know certainly not all Tibetan translations are equally good. There's good ones, there's brilliant ones, and there's also mediocre ones. But even the mediocre ones, I think, show great skill in analyzing and interpreting this foreign language, which, of course, an added difficulty was a language of a totally different language family. So Indo-European and Sino-Tibetan have, except the alphabet that they share in the writing system, they have exactly nothing in common. So the feat accomplished by these Tibetan translators was really impressive. And they needed to know their language, they needed to know their Sanskrit. So I think that part of that aspect of my research is what makes it relevant to the rest of Tibetan studies, and at least the textual part of Tibetan studies, of course.
Yeah.
So, in defense.
How do you remember the academia in the Netherlands at the time?
Yeah, well, the academia in Leiden and Amsterdam, let's start with the universities in general, is very different. The Amsterdam University is, as you might expect, much more modern, much more open to innovation, much more experimental in a way maybe. Leiden is extremely conservative. It was then and it still is. Leiden is a very old and distinguished university, and it wants to know that it is that. It is a difference. There are two entirely different worlds. So that was one thing. But within Asian studies, the numbers are very limited, and usually also in Leiden, the type of people that's drawn to these areas, they're a specific type. They don't really bother much about conventions, really, at least not in the Leiden way. So the academia, the atmosphere in academia in Amsterdam was much more liberal, in Leiden much more conservative. That's briefly said. But the sense among colleagues, students, or researchers or scholars in Asian fields, that usually is tended to be quite amicable friendships, and most of my colleagues are good friends. And that tells something about the atmosphere that was quite positive and good and warm, really. Yeah.
And then could you say a bit more about what happened after your PhD?
Yes. Well, I've already started telling you a bit about that. This KNAW, this Academy Fellowship, started after that PhD. But maybe this is a point where, no, there's one thing at least that I should mention here also that runs on in the period after the KNAW Fellowship too. My fascination with one particular Tibetan, namely Situ Penchen, the great grammarian from the Situ lineage, started already at that time. Initially because he was a major grammarian. That's what started my interest in him. But it turned out that he was a very fascinating figure in many respects. A kind of Renaissance man, if you will, man of many talents. A scholar, religious hierarch, an artist, an art patron of the arts, an expert of art, a medical doctor, a historian. It goes on and on and on. And he wrote this fantastic autobiography, which is a unique source of information about intellectual life in Tibet in the 18th century. So that became also a main track in my research interests, starting from already the period of my PhD, but growing certainly after that. Maybe one thing that I would mention also in that period is my first participation in the OHTS conferences. It starts already before my PhD defense. The first one I went to is Narita in '89. But since then I've been a regular, attended most, at least as many as I could. They were also always my favorite conference. I've attended Sanskrit conferences, intellogical ones, but IATS really was always my favorite for many reasons, but especially in the early days when it was possible still to get a feel and some basic working knowledge of the whole field. Maybe I should start Narita because that's a nice personal story. That year, 1989, I was about halfway my PhD research. And it was my first platform to present my findings, my research findings that far, so far. The number of participants was very low at the time. I'm not sure about the number, but I guess not more than 200, probably something like 150, which meant that there were only 2 parallel sessions. Can you believe it? And that meant that you got to see all kinds of things, all kinds of areas that you wouldn't perhaps automatically touch upon. And everybody that was there was accessible, due also partly to the smaller numbers, but also the atmosphere of the conferences made that very easy to do. And I found it fascinating to finally see the faces behind all these books and these articles, to get to know them as a person. Nonetheless, I was quite nervous. It was my first presentation internationally. I was looking forward, but with trepidation. My talk was scheduled at the very end of the conference, the final session on Friday. And as fate would have it, the parallel session finished earlier, so everyone gathered in this one room to hear this very shy, nervous Dutch guy give his paper. And on top of all that, I had very nasty inflammation over my eye. It looked like a blue eye. My eye was almost entirely shut. I had to wear sunglasses all through the conference, but I thought it would not really be proper to give a paper wearing sunglasses, so I took them off and put a big band-aid over it, but I felt very self-conscious, you can imagine. Nonetheless, it went like a miracle. Everybody was fantastically enthusiastic. All these big names, Steinkellner, Petek, Roy Miller, all of them were very enthusiastic about my paper. So that was an enormous boost. That was really an incredible experience, and I've thrived on that for many years. And still, when I'm thinking back of it, I can see that it was really a turning point. It really convinced me that I was doing something worthwhile. And there was an audience that was going to receive it and use it also. So that whole conference in the end was gave me a tremendous boost. Added my confidence, which I needed at the time. I was very insecure. In a way I still am maybe, but you get used to these conferences, but the first time I was really nervous about that. Some nice stories attached to that. Roy Miller, whom I met for the first time at that conference, was very impressed by my mafia sunglasses. So he, from then on, addressed all letters to me with "Dear Enforcer." I was his enforcer. Also, a nice story was that he told me he had a wonderful sense of humor. He told me that if anybody asked why this problem with the eye, he said, just tell them Roy Miller hit me. So Helga Ubach, one of the grand old ladies of Tibetan studies, during that conference actually asked me the question, what's wrong with your eye? And being a Dutchman, I blurted it out. I thought, why not? So Roy Miller hit me, and she believed it. She said, no, how can he do that? I managed to convince her it was just a joke, but years later she was still teasing me with this episode. When I came home from that was really a splendid experience, and that gave me confidence to continue. And that has been a phenomenon that I've had many of these OHTS conferences. I always get back inspired and with new energy, It's such a wonderful way to place to share all that enthusiasm. It's especially after the death of Ronald, I was more or less isolated. There's no one really you can share all the intricate problems that you have with, not even within your own department. I mean, my colleagues in Sanskrit and art history and such, they had no idea what I was doing, really. So sharing that and getting to know what others were doing and are doing and finding out and sharing their resources has made a huge difference in what you can achieve. And I guess the IHTS is still that, but with the big numbers, the atmosphere maybe has changed a little, but still I find it a very wonderful type of conference. I know that many colleagues have been thinking about splitting up the IHTS into 2 or more separate conferences, one more textual, one more historical, and that kind of thing. I can understand why. It would certainly make it possible to attend more of papers, but what I would miss dearly is the chance to get to know some anthropology, to get to know some numismatics, to get to know about Tibetan dancing, about poetry, anything besides and beyond your own field of expertise. But that would be lost, at least partly, if you would split up. So, it's a devilishly difficult issue, I know. The numbers, I think, have gotten out of hand. There are now so many participants. It's a small village. It's a potlatch. I don't know how to call it, but it's. In the old days, I'm starting to sound very old now, but in the old days, that would be, you would know everybody by name, and vice versa, and that has been lost due to the big numbers. But, and the atmosphere was usually good, although I also remember some very fierce discussions, sometimes quite heated. In Narita, my very first one, I remember that Yamaguchi, Suiho Yamaguchi, the great dean of Tibetology in Japan, and Dieter Schuh were at loggerheads about Tibetan calendar reckoning, and that was quite severe. Also, some of my close colleagues, Roy Miller and Tom Tielemans from Lausanne, had a quite vehement head-to-head in Vagenes. I was kind of caught in the middle between that, because they were these 2 scholars were actually my only 2 colleagues really in this precise same field. So it was very awkward, and I tried to do something about it. I tried to, in the next session at Graz, I actually tried and managed to get them together to sit at the table and talk. And that was some improvement, although not all of the dispute was settled then, but there was at least, they were on talking terms. In the second volume to my history, one of the sub-chapters deals with my attempt to find a middle way between their 2 positions. Broadly speaking, Tom Tielemans was always saying Tibetan indigenous grammar has some elements that are derived from India, but should be regarded in its own right. Roy Miller was always convinced that actually almost all the elementary parts of the Tibetan grammar were all based on India, which of course is not far from my own position, but I'm really actually halfway between that. I think that the Tibetan indigenous grammar does have its own techniques. There's many things to Tibetan indigenous grammar that are not based on Indian models. So regarding having an eye for these Indian models is certainly necessary, but it's not the only source from which this grammar developed. So I actually, it was natural for me to try and find a middle position between them two, and that ended up in the second book, and also resulted in their burying the tomahawk and smoking the peace pipe, up to a point at least. So it wasn't always merriment, but most of the time, yes, and I've actually probably will share with this project a number of pictures I took during OHTS seminars that show that. And one that is really, that springs to mind is again Narita, which was a memorable conference for many reasons. Somehow the organizers thought that it would be a good idea to have as a mid-week entertainment a visit with a German Bierhalle in Tokyo. It was really incredible. Imagine all of the Tibetan studies scholars at the time gathered on the 5th floor somewhere at Ginza in Tokyo in a Bierhalle, and all of the staff were dressed in lederhosen and they were serving big pints of beer. They were singing German songs in lederhosen and dirndl. It was beyond belief. I have pictures to prove it actually took place. So that was the kind of thing that you would gather and laugh. I mean, humor was always a big element in the communication between Tibetologists, I find. Many of them have a good sense of humor. So that was one example that comes to mind. Also in Graz, I remember one evening we were in a convent, used to be a convent outside of the town of Graz in Austria. And there was a courtyard where most of the time it was very hot, midsummer at the time, where we would sit in the evening. And at a given point, the atmosphere got lighter and dancing commenced. And Tibetan dances were performed by long lines of Tibetan scholars. Unfortunately, I do not have pictures to prove that, but that too was quite something. So that's, I think, very typical of the atmosphere. There was joy. Everybody was enjoying the science, the academics, the information, all these inspirations that you and information that you got, coupled with just having fun, enjoying the time, enjoying the period of Tibetan studies history, I guess. We did feel privileged, I think. At least I did. I felt it was really special to belong to this small world, and so some good, really close friendships developed from that. I know that you are not including Australia in the project on oral history.
Not yet.
Maybe you will. I hope you will, because there's a few there that deserve mention. One of my best friends there is David Templeman. You may or may not know his name. He's not really. He's what you would call a gentleman scholar. He does now have an appointment in academia in Melbourne. But he, for most of his life, he was a Tibetan studies expert in his free time. He was a high school teacher, not dissimilar maybe to Ronald in a way, but he was, his work mainly is on Taranatha, on the life and times of Taranatha, and he's a great scholar in that field. But a gentleman scholar, so not an academic as such, but he is certainly of that level. Christina Scherer from Switzerland. I've worked a long time together with her on a project on Tajur Mabaniba, the commentary on Maviupati. Unfortunately, it wasn't brought to an end, not to full completion, but we worked for many years on that. People like José Cabezón, one of my close friends. I turned 60 years ago, and for the occasion, my partner invited many of my best friends to write a page for an album, Friends. And he wrote a wonderful Tibetan poem about our friendship in that album. So, a very cherished friend. Don Lopez. What Don and I have in common is also something I share with David Templeman, namely the love for eccentric rock music like Captain Beefheart and Frank Zappa, that kind of thing. So that's one of the, outside of the field of Tibetan studies, things that we share. I'm forgetting many names, of course. Michael Hahn also, I should mention him. He was a good friend, unfortunately a few years ago passed away. We spent many evenings and afternoons poring over the minute details of some Sanskrit poem or Tibetan translation of it. And of course his interest in grammar was what we also shared. So these are the main names that come to mind spontaneously, but it is typical. So many of the colleagues that I met and got to know in person became friends. And also some students, Rob Meyer, one clear example of that. He's not really a student of mine, of course, but I co-supervised his PhD. And we also became close friends that since then. Also outside of the field of Tibetan studies proper, Johannes Bronkhorst, Indian philosophy, people like Bronkhorst is the first that comes to mind, and most important, I guess. So friendship and the joy of sharing this field were immensely important, I think.
Could you share some memories of yours of people who are not with us anymore, people important in Tibetan studies?
Sure. Michael Harris is the first that comes to mind. I didn't meet him very often, but the times that we did meet were very intensive in a way and very warm. I especially appreciated his character. He was a very warm, sharing person. Although he would, and I remember the first time that he did, when sharing some material that he had discovered or was working on, he would usually say, well, here is the material, do something with it. And that I also very much liked. I mean, sharing is one thing, but you share because we all want to get this field further ahead. That's the main point, and sharing is a way of doing that better, I think. In the end, everyone wins. There's in Buddhism this expression of something that the Buddha did not have, that's acharya mushti. It's a clenched fist. The teacher should open and give and share with his pupils, but not keep to himself his wisdom. That's one thing that he had. He didn't have a clenched fist, he shared. Michael Hahn I mentioned already. Elliot Sperling, of course, very sad that he passed away. what's the first thing that comes to mind? Well, actually, maybe his fierce position he would take in political matters. His defending of the freedom of speech of the Tibetan scholars facing the scrutiny of the Chinese authorities. When he was in, I'm not sure if he was chairing the board, but when he was in the board of the OHTS, I remember vividly one business meeting. Not sure where it was, probably in Graz, but I'm not sure, maybe Verhagen is. An early business meeting where there was an agreement that the Chinese president would not videotape the proceedings or make any sound recordings, but they did anyway. And Elliot really got mad. He practically had to restrain him physically from attacking the persons in question. So he was very outspoken, strong, and that kind of thing. But also wonderful sense of humor. I mean, not 3 or 4 sentences would come from his mouth without a joke in it. But that, of course, coupled with solid, splendid research and work, very important. He was one of these few people like Petek that knew and used Chinese sources to the maximum. And I forget his first name, Alexander. What's his first name?
Elliot Sperling.
No, Sperling. No, this is embarrassing.
We can cut this out, don't worry.
Yes, Alexander. What's his first name? The Swiss scholar about the architecture specialist. René Alexander. It's on the tip of my tongue.
Okay. Okay, it's on my tongue.
Yeah.
Andre Alexander.
Is it Andre?
Yeah, Andre Alexander.
Andre, you're right. That his passing away, Andre Alexander's passing away, that's also a big loss to Tibetan studies, I think. His work in preserving traditional architecture, although in vain for a considerable part, was very important. Yes, well, of the generation before that, Geza Urai, he was really a gentleman. He had this debonair that aristocracy of the time had. I think he was actually from a very well-to-do family, but I'm not sure about aristocracy. But he had this demeanor and this way about him, but also very warm-hearted. People like Petek also, although we never really were very close. I really admired and loved his personality. Also quite strict in a way. He was very severe, much like Michael Hahn was too. There's this kind of seriousness to them that scares off many people. And Petek was revered and sometimes feared, but once you got to know them, there was no reason for that at all. They were very open to youngsters coming along and helping them and criticizing them where necessary, of course, also. To resume about colleagues that are no longer among us, there's certainly one that is probably one of the most important Tibetan specialists that I've ever met, Gene Smith. I'll tell you my Gene Smith experience. I guess most Tibetan scholars have had such a thing. If you've met Gene, I know for a fact that many colleagues have had the same experiences, or basically the same as I have, namely one of a combination of total amazement and inspiration again. Let me tell the story. It was in Lausanne, and not during an IATS, but during an IABS, for Buddhist Studies Association in Lausanne, I think in 1999. When I met him for the first time, I, of course, had read all, or at least most of his introductions, famous introductions to the Indian reprints, and was really frustrated at never having met him. Never traveled to look him up in Delhi. But I got the chance in Lausanne, and we decided to have dinner together. And there was this famous fondue restaurant in Lausanne that we went to near the station. And it was just the two, no, there was, I think, Frans Karl Earhart was also there. But we were in a small company, and well, literally before the fondue was on the table, really literally, Jean had already pointed out 4 texts essential to my research, which I didn't even know existed. At that time, it was 99, I'd been researching on this field for only 15 years already, so I thought I knew a little. He put me straight. There's these 10 minutes, 15 minutes that we waited for the main course to arrive. He pointed out these 4 titles, all of them essential. He knew exactly what was in them, but also he knew exactly where to find them, in what library. He knew what the color was of the binding, practically on which shelf it stood. And he knew he could reproduce just offhand the minutest details about its contents and its authorship. And it was totally stunning. And so it was sobering and inspiring at the same time. That's what it amounted to. But I know for a fact that many colleagues have had these same experiences. Actually, if I can find it, I probably can. I have a picture where you can see it happen to a colleague. During the Vancouver sessions of the IATS, David Templeman, I spoke about him, this Australian Taranata specialist. And we were strolling along the roads there in the campus and bumped into Jean. And in the 5 minutes that we spent talking on the sidewalk, he did the same to David. He pointed out the existence of a unique copy of a biography of Taranata that David had no idea existed. And he knew where it was. It was in fact in Leiden, in the Verhagen collection. And I took a picture, my partner took a picture of the 3 of us when that was taking place. So that may be also nice to share in the documentation in this project. I don't think you can overstate the importance of Jean Smith. Of course, for literary, for scriptural studies primarily, but in general for knowledge of Tibetan history, of Tibetan Buddhism. He was an astounding source of information, and not only that, he was able to bring together all these materials, collected them, and set up this splendid website, now BDRC, previously TBRC, with putting all that material that's now widely available online and accessible to all of us. I don't think there's any way to exaggerate how important he was. If I had to choose, if you would put a knife to my throat, I would probably say he is the best Tibetan studies specialist I've ever known, and maybe that's ever lived. Unfortunately, Leiden University has a connection with Jean. Jean studied there for a year or two in his early years. And at a very late date only, it was decided that a doctorate would be awarded to him. That was around 2009 when this procedure was instigated, but we weren't in time. In fact, the irony of fate has it that the day when the decision was made in Leiden to award it to him, and we contacted him to notify him, was the day he passed away. So it turned out that it had to be awarded posthumously, and it was the year after we did do that, and organized a small symposium in his honor. But it would have been so much more splendid, of course, with the man in person receiving it. But that's the way it went. No way of changing that. But if anyone has ever deserved a doctorate, that is him. And I'm sure that any Tibetan scholar worth his salt will agree. About what my research went on to contain after my PhD and after this academy fellowship. I found out, you might call it, into areas where Buddhism and grammar and linguistics met. So I started reading and researching in the field of what you could call hermeneutics, the scriptural interpretation techniques and methods and principles. There's two sources for the Tibetan world that are the most important. One is Indian, that's Vasubandhu. He wrote a work called Vyakya Yukti, which is a manual on expounding and explaining the teachings of the Buddha, basically, and interpreting the words of the Buddha. Within Tibet, the work of Satya Pandita, the Kinjuk Kepa Jupiko, is of course the most important, although Sakyapa very commonly, generally used, focusing or aimed at the Tibetan readership, so not only involving the interpretation of text, but also how to translate and how to expound the teachings to the Tibetan peoples. These are the two core texts that I've been looking at in these years. So let's say from the beginning of the 2000s. A bit before then I started already. And in that period also I seriously started writing about Situ Penchen. So the series about his works, notes to his works that have come out, 7 volumes so far. 5 volumes so far. They are the result of that. And results will also be contained in a forthcoming 3rd book that's about to be completed or is almost completed and will hopefully be published in the near future. So hermeneutics, scriptural interpretation, is what got my interest. As I had done also with the studies on grammar, on indigenous grammar and Sanskrit grammar, I wrote articles preferably in the form of series, also to make clear to the reader how they connected, and that they connected at all, which was sometimes necessary, but also well, I guess that is the main reason, to make visible to the outside observer what the system was to what I was doing. In my teaching, stepping outside of the world of research, I've also, in these same years, so roughly from winding back, slightly back. After the Academy Fellowship, that is in the year 96, I was appointed permanently in Leiden. So up till then I had part-time or temporary positions. But in 96 I was appointed permanently, and that was indeed a part-time appointment, which I have until today. I've had additional funding primarily in the field of research, sometimes for teaching, in addition to that part-time appointment. I've also had temporary appointments outside of the Netherlands. I've had the privilege and pleasure of being Numata professor in SOAS, London. I've taught as a visiting professor in Leuven in Belgium. That was not really in Tibetan studies, but Buddhist studies. In addition to teaching classical Tibetan, I've also had periods where I taught Buddhism after the retirement of Professor Vetter and before Jonathan Silk arrived. There were a few years that I took care of that business. I also taught on Indian philosophy. And in the area of Tibet, I developed a number of courses. Language was one thing, and I think an essential thing to gain access to Tibet. But of course, the interest in the history and the culture and religion of Tibet is broader, and there are many students that do not take the effort or time to learn the language, but still want to know more. So there was a niche there, and I developed two courses primarily. One, culture of Tibet, say the cultural history of Tibet, and one about modern history, Tibet, state and society. And they draw far bigger numbers of students than the language courses do. Nowadays also both, and especially the latter one, are part of the curriculum of Chinese studies. So China studies students are far more numerous than Indian and Southeast Asian studies, so that meant quite an increase in the number of students that took my classes. And I think it's also an important thing that the students of Sinology, of Chinese studies, get to know a bit more about Tibet, not just base their information on primarily propagandistic information that is found within the modern Chinese world. All this research, which continues also, which includes also the work that I did before, is now finally getting its place in a third book that I'm finishing. That's almost complete. It's not a third volume to that history, but it's a separate work. The basic short title is What's in a Word, which is more or less clear why I chose that title. And it is my attempt to give an overview of what I've done in the last 30 years in this field. So it looks at grammar, how grammar was studied, what levels of competence were reached in that, how also this competence was used in the translation practice. It includes also the research on hermeneutics, so the interpretation part, and it has a very lengthy chapter specifically about Situ Panchen. So all the main threads in my work come together in that book, which will hopefully be published not at Brills, but in Harvard Oriental Series. But that is very recent. I've actually finished it. You could say I'm applying the finishing touches still, but it is finished. Was finished last year. And I hope that publishing will not take very long, although in our world usually it does. There's no way of telling that. But so that's, broadly speaking, the course my research took since the PhD and the fellowship of the academy.
Could you say a bit more about how your research focus has been changing or developing? What were the incentives or reasons behind?
Well, in a way, of course, there's always more to be done, but I felt that what I wanted to do in the field of grammar, I had done. I'm not saying that it is the last word in the field, by no means, but these two volumes, they form a kind of solid foundation that can be used by future scholars and has been used by present-day scholars, and I'm glad to see that. Of course, that's one of the most rewarding things to see happen. But not only that, I was also, of course, have always been interested in Buddhism. So I was starting to wonder how this field of grammar and let's say linguistics fitted in Buddhist thinking and Buddhist practice. Especially in the area of philosophy, of course, there's lots of touching areas between linguistics and philosophy in India in general, and Buddhism included. And also for some practical reasons, I thought that my chances of either increasing my appointment in Leiden or finding a full professorship elsewhere would increase if I was not just focusing entirely on grammar, but was broadening the scope. But it was primarily because I was simply interested and curious. I hope it's not all too disappointing, but in these choices have often been led by simply the feeling that I wanted to do it. And it fascinated me. And I thought it was worthwhile. Of course, not everything that I find interesting is as worthwhile to do as the other thing. But this, fanning out, broadening the scope, that's one of the basic reasons. I thought it was important and could lead to some interesting results. And also I found that many colleagues were agreeing and were enthusiastic about the choice and supportive, which is always an important thing, especially if you study, working alone in your study, poring over the books or your computer screen. It's an important thing to have that your motivation be strengthened by the interest of others. And that combined is probably what led to this choice.
Why do you regard the linguistic element so important in a culture and in a religion? Or in Tibetan culture and Buddhism?
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting question. That could lead to a very long answer.
Another book.
Another book, maybe even. Yeah. I could say read book 3, but no. Yeah. Well, of course, language has always been my vehicle of choice. I think that by means of language, much can be done. I think that it is possible more than just communicating trivial thoughts or even deep thinking. It can work on many levels, language. I think quite a few of them subconscious. So the importance of language as a transmission vehicle of communication in the widest sense, I think that is its main importance. Logos. the word, the relationship between word and God, and the divine or the absolute or whatever name you want to give it. It's a medium. It's an intermediate. How do you call it? Intermediary between us and what's out there, whatever it may be, and then added to that, in the case of Tibet, this translation process rather, that was necessary to convey Buddhism, transport Buddhism into Tibet, shows, I think, that much can be done by language. The fact that Tibet has become basically a Buddhist country, based on, at least for the written sources, something entirely alien to them. It says something about the force and what language can do, I think. Maybe that's a brief way of saying it, but I'm always think of the triad, the famous triad in Buddhism, Avalokiteshvara, Manjushri, Vajrapani. We have the body and the mind. That's clear, but in between there's language. And that's partly physical and partly mental and spiritual also. Yeah. I'm amazed that not everybody loves it. It fascinates me no end, and I think that's one of the reasons that you can do so much with it, with language in general, and also with knowledge or with understanding of language.
As you worked on art, why would you consider art or the visual aspect of a culture important?
Well, that too, I mentioned it in my first stories about my youth, is old. This drawing racing cars and Indians and cowboys, and the link between drawing and writing. I think that I'm a great fan, was as a kid, still am, of comics. I love the connection, the intermingling of storytelling and visual art. And that's what you have an abundance of in Tibetan art. Stories are told in art. So it's another way of conveying, of communication. Not very dissimilar from language, I think. It's a visual language, you might say. So that, and of course the love was strengthened by my teaching of from Ronald. His love was contagious.
Peter, could you say a bit more about your different roles as a university teacher? Mm-hmm. You probably supervise students, or you must have done different things.
Well, yes, certainly. In modern academia, at least in Leiden, the supervising of PhD theses used to be regarded as research, and all the other supervision is teaching. I think that distinction is too arbitrary. It doesn't really work that way. But yes, of course, I always say that Tibet is my shop at Leiden University. So anyone who does anything in the field of Tibet ends up in my office. And so I've supervised and assisted in many different ways many students that did research on Tibet, ranging from love songs in Amdo to political modern history, to ancient inscriptions. So that meant that in many of these cases I first of all had to make myself more acquainted with the intricacies of that specific theme or topic. And supervising in, especially the last 15 years, has often been done in connection with courses that I developed, the culture course and the modern history course. The latter course is also one where it is possible to write a BA thesis in, so I've supervised quite a few of them too, which are then usually, almost always, BA thesis in Chinese studies, by the way. But in that sense, Leiden University is quite liberal, and Tibet politically is part of China, so it's also part of the curriculum of that department, which I took a bit of time to get used to, coming from a connection with India. But anyway, I think it's good. I think it's certainly valuable that also students that may later on become diplomats in China or in the Chinese world have some awareness of what's going on in Tibet and what Tibet is.
Have you had students who you would consider your successors, or some important students in some ways?
Yeah. Well, there's a few that I could mention that I would say are important. My actual successor I've not met yet, unfortunately. I hope every year when a new year starts, I think, and I see the new faces, I think maybe he or she is there, sitting right in front of you. But so far, no. There's been a few that went on seriously into Tibet and in Tibetan studies. But in my specific field, in grammar and linguistics and hermeneutics, not really, no. Only one I could mention that's very recent. That was in Heidelberg. There was a PhD defended last year there by Alex Graaf, who was quite a brilliant student of Birgit Kellner before she moved back to Vienna, who wrote a very impressive thesis on certain parts in Situ's grammar work. And I was hoping for some time that he might be that hoped for successor, but doesn't look like that will happen. He was hedging his bets, let's say, and has also invested heavily in developing ICT skills. And I fear that his future job-wise will lie there. So the brief answer, specifically in my field, no, not really, unfortunately. There's been a few that were quite enthusiastic, but in the end decided on different topics. But in general, important students that I've worked with and supervised, I mentioned him already, Rob Meyer is one, although he did much of his research before he came to Leiden in the UK, but in the end I worked through and worked together with him on this entire thesis. Another is Antonio Terone. You may have heard his name. He's an Italian, native Italian, but now in the US, who did research on a Tetum, a treasure discovered, Dijin Sedorje, in eastern Tibet, who was active in the 20th, early 21st century. So these are the main ones that I would think I would mention. I've had only two colleagues, not really students, although I taught both of them, but they very much went their own way. Henk Blazer, of course, now used to be at Leiden, but now is in Amsterdam at the Free University there, and Bert Janssen. But I mean, when Bertha arrived, she had already such a terrific command of Tibetan that there was very little need to teach her in that respect. But she did take a few classes with me. And I think, I learned a lot from her, and I hope she learned a little from me. It was a give and take situation. So these are the names that really spring to mind. Yeah.
Could you say a bit about Tibetan studies in the Netherlands in general?
Well, I have, in a way, besides these two names that I mentioned just now and myself, there's very little going on. I should of course certainly mention Wim van Spengen. He was an historian. Not his appointment in Amsterdam, he worked at the university. Wasn't in the area of Tibet, but his research was. And he has passed away some years ago, but he was an important name in that field. A bit longer ago, and not having published very much, but Peter Richardus. He was active in the 1980s, wrote a few papers on the autobiographies of the assistants of Johan van Manen. Van Manen is of course a name I should also mention. That's before my time, but if you speak about the history of Tibetan studies, let's go back before my time, and there's a few names there too. To begin with, Johan van Manen. He was not a scholar, not an academic really. He was started out as a follower of the Theosophist movement, Blavatsky and such. He was a close personal friend of hers. And he lived in India, in Calcutta mainly, for for 2 decades almost, in the 20s and 30s. And he had special interest in Tibet, and also not only Tibet, but some very specific interests within that field. For instance, he was one of the earliest to collect Bumpo texts at all in Western academics. So that already says what he did. He collected. He was a major collector. His collection of art, of Tibetan art, is the core of the collection of the Ethnology Museum in Leiden. And his book collection, he had his Tibetan assistants. He had a few travel to Tibet and had them let them order and have books printed and bring them along to Calcutta. That collection is now in Leiden also, and that is has been digitalized. It may in some future time be included in the BRC holdings, but it isn't yet. But it is online accessible via Leiden University. So that's a very important early name. In academia, there's only a few that I could think of. De Jong, of course, was the first professor of Tibetan and Buddhist studies in Leiden. World famous scholar, later on spent most of his life in Australia. He was succeeded by Ruek. I'm sure you know him, now in the UK too, for a couple of years, and then after his after he left Ronald Poelmeijer as of course his successor in a way, but not appointed as professor, unfortunately. Well, that's, I think, are the most important Dutch names. Linking back to Van Manen and Richardus, these assistants of Van Manen, they wrote autobiographies at the request of Van Manen himself in Tibetan, and that was in India, I'm not really sure by whom, also very roughly translated into English. And these autobiographies have been worked on by Peter de Chardes. So these are publications of his hand that you may find. Ronald Poelmeijer, unfortunately, combination of his health and his unrelenting criticism of his own work, didn't publish very much. He was too critical. It was never really right. It was never perfect, and he wanted it to be that. So in the end, he didn't publish that much, and in fact, he didn't finish his PhD either. That's not to say that he couldn't. In the course of these years, I've heard oral versions of theses that would have given him a cum laude doctorate, but he never was satisfied himself, so he kept rewriting and changing again, and as a result, far too little was published, unfortunately, but a few articles were. He participated in the very first, it wasn't the IATS, he had the very first seminar for young Tibetologists, I think it was called, in Germany. And he participated in a few of these Ksoma de Keurig symposiums. So he wrote papers, but there too, very rarely were they published. He would always have second thoughts. But that's a great shame, because that meant that, of course, without a doctorate, an appointment as a professor is impossible. His health finally caught up with him and led to him having to leave the job. Well, to be precise, oral history, very rarely it's said aloud, but actually he was fired by Leiden University while he was ill, which is a legal impossibility. Actually, you cannot be fired as a civil servant in Holland during illness, but it happened to him, and that led to some very bad feelings on his part towards the university. It was a very cruel way in which he was treated, I think. And that added a kind of bitterness also to, well, bitterness is not the right word, but I found it awkward and painful to succeed him after he had been fired. It was a kind of injustice that I felt was committed. But as you hear, it's a very small world. Tibetan studies in Holland have never known many participants.
Has it been always part of an Indian studies department or Far East studies, or how does do these arrangements work?
The Tibetan was only taught in Leiden, and there it was, when I started as a student and the first years when I worked there, linked to India. This link to Chinese studies is much more recent. Nowadays, by the way, it's not really. The appointment in Leiden is to a research institute, and your teaching can be given in different departments also. So I'm in a kind of global umbrella institute of area studies, which includes everything outside of Europe, basically. Very Orientalist name, I think, but area studies is what they call it. So it's possible that my teaching is placed in curriculums of different departments than Indian studies, and it has been, especially Chinese studies. Occasionally also teaching on Buddhism finds its way into philosophy departments and theology departments also. But the strongest link has always been with India. Yeah.
Have you been, in fact, always during your career, the main person working on Tibet in the Netherlands?
I would guess I would have to say so. I mean, it's not maybe right to say that about yourself, but yeah, I was the only one appointed. Structurally, Henk Dezer and Bertie Janssen had appointments, but all temporary. In the case of Henk, quite a number of years, but nonetheless temporary, and these appointments were primarily, almost exclusively for research. So all teaching really was done by me. Yeah.
Did you have the opportunity to travel to Tibet or other areas of Tibetan culture?
Well, I was, of course, knew this question was coming. It may surprise you, or it shouldn't, because I told you before, but I've never actually visited Tibet. That has a few reasons. One, practically speaking, it wasn't necessary. All Tibetans that were working on the fields of grammar, at least in the 80s and 90s, they were in exile. They were not living in the TAR anymore. There was never really I was never a linguist in the sense of doing field work. Modern spoken dialects, I've never really researched into that. There was no real reason to go there to do field work. But added to that was my reluctance, my kind of feeling bad about the situation of traveling through the country with all the restrictions that were in place at the hand of a Chinese guide. It didn't feel right to me. I felt a kind of repulsion from this kind of situation. So it never happened. But I did travel in Asia and visited areas near Tibet, but never Tibet proper. I've never been much of a traveler in that sense that I've spent months on end in Far Eastern areas. I was always finding my books and my written sources in Europe and the States, and especially now with all these things available online, there's wealth of material available. So the short answer is no, never visited Tibet.
But you mentioned you've been to Asia, so you've probably visited some places where Tibetans live outside of
Certainly.
Tibet as such.
Certainly, yes. Especially in India, I've spent some time in the used to be called the Central Institute for Tibetan Higher Studies, now the University in Sanat. And that's one place. Also in Japan, the Tibetans working there. In Europe, of course, many European institutes I visited. Tibetan scholars were working, and I was in touch with them, exchanging all kinds of information with them. Yes, but as is the case for Western academics in Tibetology, also in the Tibetan world itself, there's very few that actually delve into the world of grammar. It is a small niche, and even among the Tibetans, there's very few that really work on that.
Have you been observing changes of theoretical discourses in Tibetan studies or studies of Tibetan grammar during your career?
Well, of course, I've seen changes in the field of Tibetan studies, in general, many. But in my own niche, in my own specific area, not really. Probably the most fundamental change has been the growth of sources available, the explosion of materials that is available online or digitally otherwise, that's incomparable to when I started out. And that is kind of revolution, which has its good and also its well, maybe not bad sides, but there's this slight disadvantages to this wealth, this abundance of material. Namely, it's harder and it gets harder and harder to cover it all. Just to keep track of what's going on and appearing and being made available is a job in itself. And this task was much easier in the earlier times when I started. What is better? Yeah, I don't think it makes much sense to think about that. We are facing the situation that we have now. And of course, this richness, this wealth of material is overwhelming, but also a great treasure. And that's one thing that I've seen changing. It used to be feasible to have a kind of overview of the whole field. Nowadays, that's impossible, really. There's simply too much. And specialization is a result, of course, of the abundance of sources also. You need to specialize, and that's what has happened. But theoretically, methodical changes in my own research, no, not really. I'm an old-fashioned text scholar. I'll be frank about it. I use modern methods and techniques, technical in the sense of materials available, but I'm still poring over text and trying to make sense of them.
Have the degrees Tibetan Studies or Indo-Tibetan Studies taught at the university changed in some ways since you were a student?
Yeah, I think so. I think, generally speaking, there's more attention to the modern period. I think when I started, not just Tibet, but Indian and Asian studies in general tended to focus quite heavily on the classical periods, the history. And the awareness of modern times and the developments there was less than it is now. That's one clear difference I see. Yeah, I would, and of course, well, that goes in general for Oriental studies, the awareness of Orientalism and that kind of defects that earlier studies have had, tendency to work along these lines. Since academia has become more aware of that, that has led also to changes. I think that are for the better, obviously. I mean, regarding this field of study as the other and dealing with it as such is what was common in my early days, but that has fortunately, I think, improved. It hasn't disappeared entirely, I fear, but still it has improved, and that is a big change also. Yeah. But as in a way, my teaching that I received from Ronald contained already this awareness that it was really, really important to look into what Tibetans themselves said and wrote and thought about their own culture, and not just look at it as an outsider, but try to get the valuable that they could contribute to this discourse, give that a prominent place. In that he was ahead of his time, I think.
I should add a question to the Tibetan studies you've been involved in. Mm-hmm. Did Tibetan studies exist, or do they exist now as a discipline, or is it part of Far Eastern studies or aerial studies? Is there something called Tibetan Studies Department or degree or something?
No, the brief answer is there's no separate degree, there's no separate institute. The situation has changed several times. When I started, there was a department devoted to, in Leiden that is, devoted to South and Central Asian languages and cultures. In other words, India and Tibet. That was what it amounted to, and a bit of Mongolia. But basically India and Tibet. So then already it was part of that umbrella, in India-Tibet. After a few reforms and changes and reorganizations, we are now in a situation where there's an even bigger institute called Leiden Institute of Area Studies, under which fall certainly all Oriental studies. That in the case of Leiden has a big component is Japan and China. The Chinese Studies Department of Leiden is for the arts faculty huge. Compare that, let's say, Indian studies will be chosen by maybe 10 students a year. Chinese studies had, I'm not sure about recent years, but there were years that were 150, 120 first-year students coming in every year. So they have a big share of that. And as for degrees, you get a degree in our institute nowadays that can focus on an area, and in case you choose Tibet, you actually choose either South Asia or East Asia. And within that bigger whole, you may choose Tibetan as the main language and then do research on Tibet. But there's no separate degree or as such, and there's never been really a separate institute. I will share with the project also a picture I took of the Buddhology Library in Leiden in 1976, I think. And that's as independent as the study of Tibet ever became. It was a separate room in the library, but not really a separate department. But if a student, the few that did, really wanted to focus exclusively on Tibetan, it would be under the umbrella of Indian studies or East Asian studies. In my beginning years, it was almost always in connection with India. Nowadays, more often it is linked with Chinese studies. But no professorship either, since Verhagen you could call a kind of Tibetologist, although he was probably primarily Buddhologist. He is, but the professorships were never exclusively for Tibetan. It was always Indian philosophy, Buddhism, and Tibetan. That was one professorship. And Vetter, who was there in Leiden until 2000, for 25 years, so I received my PhD under him. He was, well, it's no coincidence that from the moment I got my appointment as PhD researcher, I was given the teaching task. He was never a Tibetologist. He used Tibetan, like he would use Pali and Sanskrit and Chinese, and later on even Japanese, as a vehicle to Buddhist studies. But as a Tibetan study specialist as such, he wouldn't call himself that. So no professorship, no department, no separate degree. Although if you get a degree, MA or also PhD, your focus of research will be clear by the titles that are given. For instance, the title of your thesis will be indicative that you are a Tibetan specialist, but it will not read you are now a doctor in Tibetan studies. It will read you are a doctor in Indian languages and cultures.
Could you say a bit about Indian studies in the Netherlands? You mentioned that the places where they are taught changed.
Yes, changed and shrunk and disappeared even. Yes, there were, well, starting with the smallest, there used to be a small department in Groningen, which is a tiny town. Well, Groningers will be mad at me. A smaller city in the Netherlands, in the northeast of the country, and that has a very old university also, and there you could, until very recently, study Sanskrit. But that was it. It was only restricted to Sanskrit language and literature. No, as far as I remember, no other topics. In Utrecht and Leiden and Amsterdam, you would have bigger, more options, bigger institutes. And in fact, I mentioned it before, in Amsterdam there were two. There was an institute for Indian languages and one for Indian history and art. Utrecht, Indian studies was concentrated in one department, but contained also various disciplines. Utrecht was very strong, for instance, in Vedic Sanskrit, or the oldest Sanskrit. Gonda, the famous Dutch Indologist, one of the most famous, was in Utrecht. And his successor also did a lot of work on that early Vedic period. There were also religious historians there. Schoteman is one. Several of them had an interest in tantric forms of Hinduism and Buddhism. Also a few of them worked not only on South but also Southeast Asian tantric studies, so Indonesia primarily. That was Utrecht, and Leiden has always been the biggest of them all, in numbers of professors and lecturers, but also in numbers of students, and also in numbers of topics and classes to choose from. They have an old tradition in Indonesian, starting out from Indonesian, but branching also out into Indian art history. Gadestin was a world-leading expert on epigraphy of Indonesia. Art and history, and not to forget Heesterman, a very famous historian of India, appointed for modern history, but actually covering all of Indian history. And then Buddhist studies, Buddhology. There was in the Chinese department Zürcher, the famous name of Chinese Buddhist history, and Vetter, I think, with his predecessors, de Jong and Ruek, they were the major names in Buddhist studies at the time in Holland. But de Jong was Dutch, Ruek and Vetter were not, actually. I'm not really sure where Ruek was born, but he wasn't Dutch. He was German? I forget, actually.
It's a Swiss surname.
Swiss-German, yeah. And well, Vetter was German, but de Jong was a real Dutch by birth and nationality. Yeah.
You did also mention the International Association of Buddhist Studies.
Yes.
Could you say a bit more about your involvement with the association?
Well, that has not been as intensive or intense as with IATS, but I've attended quite a few of the conferences. I'm therefore considered a full member, but it's always been taken second place in my focus of research. But it became more important when I started doing this work on hermeneutics, of course. Then my interest in Buddhism became more professional also. Personally, I've always been interested in it. I wouldn't call myself a practicing Buddhist, but I don't think there's a way of being involved in these kind of studies without getting some personal involvement in it. What I've always regretted not having done for many years, I was intending to, I never learned Chinese. I always found that that would be a perfect addition to my knowledge of Sanskrit and Tibetan. Never happened. Now I'm for sure too old to start. So there's aspects of Buddhist studies that I couldn't really get into very deeply, lacking the language knowledge. But it has always been an important part of my fascination with Tibet. There too, in the IABS circles, I have a few very good friends. Paul Harrison is one example. He also spent some time in Holland, and before then already we were good friends. He was one of these early Buddhist studies specialists that had all the languages. He knew and read very well and knew very well Chinese, Japanese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Pali, etc., etc. He had it all at his disposal. So there's a few links there. There's a few links there too. Yeah, but given the choice, I would choose always the IHTS as my main association.
You have worked on a number of important Tibetan scholars. Would you have a favorite one? And why?
Yes. Well, I think with some hesitation, maybe I don't want to exclude so many others, but Situ Panchen is my favorite Tibetan, at least in the field that I've done my research in. And being an expert in so many different areas, it's very hard not to like him, I think. He's a very special figure in Tibetan history, a kind of universal mind. So that would be the first one, but there's a few others. And no surprise, probably some of them are grammarians, but not only. Bhutan as a masterful scholar, so important for linguistics, but also for literary history in general, editing, Kanjur and all that. Taranatha, certainly, not only because my good friend David Templeman has written so much about him, but he is also a very fascinating figure. In more modern days, Kinun Chimpel, very popular in Tibetology since many decades, and I share that fascination. He's also one of these free minds in Tibetan history that make him very attractive to research into. Well, I don't know if he is really a historical figure, but I guess I should mention Tongni Sambota, the founder of Tibetan indigenous grammar. And whether or not he was one person or not, whether he was actually the author of what we now have as Sungchupa and Takijukpa, I know there's lots of discussion possible about it, but he and early figures like Cheki Truk, an early translator from the also royal period, Chudrup, Fa Cheng, also active in Dunhuang. They are fascinating figures, especially they're laying the foundation for this enormous edifice of translated literature. It never ceases to amaze me. But top three would be, I guess, Situ Panchen, Taranatha, and Kinun Chimpel. Yeah. But you do, especially in the case of Situ, when you spend so many years reading so many of his works, and especially his autobiography, even they start to feel like friends. Although you're centuries apart, you could almost invite them for coffee. And of course, this autobiography is a wonderful source. You can really explore his life, and he committed so much information to his diaries, and he was seemed to be interested in everything that he came across, and he always has something interesting to say about it. So if I need to choose one, then it would be Situ Penchen Chögygyüngne.
Personally, what would you say your career in Tibetan or Indo-Tibetan studies has given to you?
Yes, and how has it enriched my life? Well, indeed. I think it will not come as a surprise that it has done so. It has enriched my life immensely. And my involvement in Tibetan studies would probably be unthinkable and probably would never have happened without having met this Ronald Poelmeijer. So this chance meeting, is it chance, is it coincidence, is it karma, give it a name, doesn't matter. It happened. That has meant so much for the direction my life took since then. It's hard to exaggerate and hard to overstate. So that was one form of enrichment, and this happening at such an early age, such a young age, makes a world of a difference too, of course. It feels to me that my involvement in Tibetan studies is kind of second nature. It's part of my personality, really gone deep into my character and my thinking and my feeling and my inner world. So that's an enrichment. Yeah, well, it's hard to surpass. That is something that has really made a big difference. The way Ronald Poelmeijer taught me, and the young age at which it happened, and the stages in which it happened, primary school, high school, and university, and after, have made this friendship a huge part of my life, and therefore I feel very rich having shared that. I can really truthfully say that there's really not a day that passes that I do not think of advice he gave me or a joke he made, or when I hear myself teaching Tibetan, I hear him still. Although I do many things very differently from but still, I feel that at the core of it is his work, his voice. So it's gotten very deeply under my skin. His death it was 93, by the way, has left in that sense a great void. I miss him to this day, really. But I was fortunate to be able to follow in his footsteps, continue the good work in my own limited fashion. But that work, that teaching, that research has enriched my life immensely too. I've enjoyed, well, of course, there are moments that you're tired and you get stuck in a problem and you don't see a way of solving it. But still, the fascination always came first and was more dominant. I've never had a dull moment in this field. And especially when you're exploring new ground, breaking new ground, and the rewarding feeling that you get when you succeed, when you finally make sense of this, that's a wonderful experience. And I don't think, well, I suppose you can have that in any field of any area of human activity, I suppose, and certainly in any academic field or any field of culture that you devote yourself to. The gratification of managing to do that is immense. I never really understand people who say, I feel bored. I've never really known or understood the meaning of the word boredom. Well, the short answer is it has enriched my life immensely. Also the people I've met, the friendships that have grown out of that shared interest. I should certainly mention my partner, Jeanette Snijders, who has been my partner for more than 10 years now. We got together because we share the interest in Tibetan studies. So, on all kinds of levels, it has enriched my life immensely. And I shudder to think what my life would have looked like without this meeting with this one person. I probably would have ended up somewhere in some dull office, doing a respectable job, I'm sure. But the way I've lived my life and how I've been given the freedom to explore, to really indulge in your interests, your fascination. It's fantastic, and that the rich feeling that I have is not only that, of course. I mean, Tibetan studies is not all my life. I have interests and fascinations and emotional attachments and all kinds of links with many different things other than Tibetan studies. Music is one, arts in general, many. But that Tibetan core, that I could really not imagine, really picture what my life would look like without it.
What did you find the most interesting in your work and the most challenging?
Yes. Well, I think starting with both most interesting and most challenging at the same time is breaking new ground, exploring new areas, as they would used to say in Star Trek, boldly going where no man has gone before. That kind of feeling of exploring, that is fascinating. Interesting is a very mild way of putting it. But at the same time, of course, very challenging. It's not easy to do. And very often one gets stuck in a problem that might not have occurred if a longer, older tradition of study in that field existed. But if you're the first or one of the very first, you meet all these obstacles and you have to climb them yourself. So it's both. So interesting, certainly. Challenging also. Challenging in a different sense, but nonetheless challenging, are circumstances under which academia has survived so far. And what I've encountered in the academic university world since the 1970s. A constant process of cutbacks and reorganizations and pressure on the smaller studies, as they used to be called, the exotic studies, of which Tibetan, of course, is one, fighting against these forces, keeping your head above water, and simply, in many cases, keeping your job was hard work, and still is. When I started, it was much less, but it has grown and grown. You need to justify your existence. You need to justify by showing numbers of students and that kind of thing that what you're doing is worthwhile and should be done. And that's quite a challenge. And that has made me lose my good humor more than once. It gets very frustrating having to time and again explain why Tibet and Tibetan studies and Buddhist studies and such are important, maybe certainly in the case of Buddhist studies, I think essential in any university. Still, you have to justify that claim. And that's harder, has gotten harder and harder with the managers ruling. Money talks, also at universities, and us small studies who have so few students who bring in so little money, we have a hard time at keeping our head above water, as I said. So that and that doesn't go only for Holland. I'm fully aware of that. I saw just a few months ago a talk by Michel Timmerman about the situation of Tibetan studies and in the Indian studies in Germany, and that is very depressing. That is really very depressing. Even in Germany, with its old, rich tradition of Indology, major departments have simply been abolished. There's a list of them that have either been minimized or have disappeared entirely. So it's not just Holland, I'm aware of that, and I guess also symptomatic of that situation is my personal appointment. I had this PhD research position first, but this academy fellowship is really a prestigious fellowship and would entail, in fact, the obligation for Leiden University to give me a full-time appointment. It never did. I still have a half-time position, and it's a bit out of balance to have a person that is working 2.5 days a week, do all teaching with regard to Tibet. I mean, it's not really a reasonable proposition, actually. And I'm curious what will happen when I retire, if they can at all find someone that's willing to do that for just a half-time position. That's no worry of mine then, but it's symptomatic. It's symptomatic. There's a very little allowance, a very little funds and possibility and infrastructure allowed for these type of fields. And that is quite challenging. And that has, I've never regretted the choices I've made, but I have lamented the lack of support from the higher authorities in universities quite often. And that has started from when I was a student, already then. I cannot remember otherwise than that there was some thread somewhere, some sort of Damocles hanging above our head. And that's the other part of it, but I wouldn't have missed it for the world. It's the rewarding, the interesting, the positive feeling and rewards that I get. What I receive back from what I do in this field is always put these opposing forces in the shade.
What did you find the most interesting? Did we cover that point?
Mm-hmm.
The most interesting in your work?
Well, I think that's not part of that is inserted, yes. I think I've said a few things about it. It's hard to pinpoint precisely. It is a very broad sense of language. To me, is a kind of portal, and the access to that language is at the same time access to the people behind it and the culture behind it. So that is the key thing, I think. It opens up the view, my and our view, to a world that would remain hidden without it. But then, next step might be why interest in Tibet. Well, that I find much harder to pinpoint. It's the early years in which I've first received input on it that played a role. It was indeed a contagious enthusiasm that Ronald had that rubbed off on me. And yeah, the Tibetans that I've met and the sense I get from Tibetan culture is simply sympathetic to me. I don't know how to put it else. Otherwise, it fits in with my own character structure, I guess. And somehow the two feel at ease with one another. I guess that's a brief way of putting it.
What do you see as your most significant academic contributions and why?
Well, I would have to say that the two books that have come out and my publications in general, but especially these two books, I would think were generally, at least I find them my biggest contribution, and I think there's some reason to conclude that many colleagues agree. They have become a kind of standard work of reference, and that is, of course, a very, very wonderful thing to experience. To find out that what has been put on paper with many drops of transpiration and a bit of inspiration, with so many years invested in it, to see it come to fruition in that sense that it starts to live and is used and referred to. Yeah, it's incomparable. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing to do and to experience. So I would guess that these two books are my main contribution. And through these books, I hope that somehow I have added to the awareness of the importance of the topics in them. I think that before these books, it was much easier to disregard this aspect of the translation practice, for instance. Nowadays, now that these books are there, you cannot really avoid them. You need to address some of the issues that they address. And I think that is at least a contribution that for the most part comes from my own hands, and that's gratifying beyond words.
Are there still topics, things you would like to pursue?
Yes, well, given enough years, of course. Hermeneutics of Indo-Tibetan Buddhism that I've looked at so far was mainly Mahayana. My initial plan was also to look at Tantric Buddhism and hermeneutics in there, but turned out to be very difficult and a very different cup of tea from Mahayana hermeneutics. So I left that more or less. I've done a bit here and there, but if I have a chance, that's one thing. Have a look at these scriptural interpretation principles in Tantric Buddhism. I would like also to top off my work on Situ Panchen by writing a biography of him, either based primarily, of course, on his autobiography, but A Life and Times of Situ Panchen. That as a second. And I would probably, if these two works would be finished, or maybe before, also like to have more looks into the world of Kinun Chimpel, his linguistic observations in his Sekitama and other works, his very modern, innovative way of thinking, his refusal of following the conventional orthodox rikne in Tibetan sense. That would be the third on the list. But with these three things, I think I've pretty much spent up the time that is still available to me.
And as you know, we are conducting this project for contemporary and future generations of researchers and students and people interested in Tibetan studies. Mm-hmm. Would you have a message for them?
Yeah, well, I think probably you've gotten the message already, but I think the one thing that I would say is if it grabs you, allow that to happen. Allow yourself to be grabbed and enthused by it, and grab it yourself. If this sense that I had of this opportunity given by meeting this one person, if a similar thing happens to you, don't ignore it. Cultivate it. See where it leads. Of course, it doesn't necessarily have to be exactly Tibetan studies or grammar or whatever. I think it's a general advice in life. If there's something that comes on your path that really touches you, don't think, well, this is not convenient. Probably in the case of Tibetan studies, don't let yourself be distracted by the uncertainty of a career, of economic, of wealth. There's a lot of wealth, but not necessarily in financial sense. The riches that I've gotten from the world of Tibet are from a different kind. Of course, I've made a living. I'm extremely grateful for that I can make a living out of on the basis of my hobby, really. But don't expect too much in that respect, but you can expect a tremendous world full of unexplored things. That was true when I started, still is. It's a world where there's so much that of value to be found. Allow it to grab you, and allow at least yourself the chance to explore it and see what it does and what it can lead to. I see that in all my students. I don't think I really have to advise them to do that, but if anything, that would be it. Just follow your enthusiasm.
Thank you, Peter. It has been a pleasure and honor to talk to you.
It was a pleasure and an honor also to contribute. Thank you.
Thank you.